have a repo this time
Budget.
instead of a floppy drive. So in a way, he is carrying on the grand tradition of the Power Toys.
But I think one interesting thing you didn't talk about, though, with Power Toys is a lot of those features made it into the operating system.
In a way, so part of the thing, once people realize that, hey, there's this Power Toys thing, and people kind of like them, and some teams would sort of use them as ways to either get out a tool that they decided initially they were going to do things the right way and get all the paperwork done for putting stuff up, and they found that the paperwork is taking forever, and they're like, what about those guys? They're like throwing random stuff up on the website. Can you just throw our thing in there? And it's like, yeah, sure, we'll just put it in there. Don't worry. And so like the time zone editor tool was one of those things. The Tappy sync toy or something, I think was one of them. Or there was a synchronization thing. There was some really, really obscure stuff like there was the telephony, like customizing dial-out codes based on area code tool, like some wacky stuff that nobody today cares about. But back then, when you had your 56K modem, like you cared about, getting the AT plus whatever thing working right. And then there's sort of the Power Toys lesser known spin-off, the Kernel Toys, which was also a collection of little toys that were more, like the name says, more kernel related. So it had to do with like performance tracing of the boot sequence, letting you build MS-DOS boot floppies for you to play your highly tailored game that needs a whole 760K of conventional memory. For those of you who remember what that is. For those of you who don't, it's this weird thing. Don't worry about it. You're glad it's over. And the Kernel Toys was basically just stuff that I wrote, like my own stuff. But I just pretended I had a team of thousands behind me, and I wrote the blurb that said that the kernel people. My excuse for not polishing them was saying that these programs were written by kernel developers, so don't expect to see very useful UI, and because after all, these are the people who do their taxes in hexadecimal. So that was my joke. I'm very proud of it. I'm telling the joke again 30 years later. So that was like the Kernel Toys, the Power Toys sort of forgotten spin-off that got canceled after 2 seasons, or canceled after like 2 weeks. Didn't make it to the end of the season. Got canceled after 2 weeks. So that's sort of the origin story of the Power Toys, plus some digressions into forgotten cousins.
Well, and a nice thing also with it is Raymond does actually have a Power Toys in the new Power Toys. Find My Cursor was written by Raymond. It was a fix hack learn project, I think, internally.
Yeah, it sort of was a similar thing to what led to most of the Power Toys initially, which is, you have a thing, it bothers you, you write a program to solve it, and then somebody sees it and says, hey, what's that thing? That's cool. And so it's like, okay, I guess it's useful to more than one person. And Clint was stupid enough to accept my pull request, so now it's in the real thing.
Stupid, honored. I prefer honored. Okay, let's actually go to a question. I'm going to go with Gareth. I see your question. I'm going to go to that. But however, Mike asks, why do some system tray icons, if like the app crashed, you have to move your mouse to make them disappear?
Yes.
As a person who may have an app that occasionally crashes from time to time, this is a very interesting question.
Okay, so the way those things are programmed, you create a window, you register the window with the system saying, hey, here's a window, and I would like you to display an icon, and when somebody does something with the icon, please notify this window. And so the system doesn't sit around constantly checking. It's like, hey, window, are you still there? How about now? How about now? How about now? It only checks when there is something that the system needs to do with that window. And the most common thing that you'd have to do with that window is on your way to clicking on it, you have to move towards it. And once the mouse hits the icon, the rule is, oh, we will tell the window, hey, the mouse is now over your icon. And at that point, we realize when we send the message and we get the error saying, what are you talking about? That window's gone. We're like, oh, I'm sorry. Sorry, my mistake. And then we take it away, because only then do we realize that the window's gone. And so there's some internal debate as to whether this is good or bad behavior, because from an end user standpoint, this is bad behavior, because it means that there are these things hanging around in your notification area that are actually dead. They're zombies, and they only get cleaned up when you basically have to scrub your mouse back and forth over the notification area to get them all to receive a, oh, by the way, the mouse is over your icon message, and then the system says, oh, but there's no window there, so I better take them away. On the other hand, if they were cleaned up automatically by the system, then that would just tell developers that, oh, don't worry about cleaning up this stuff. Like, go ahead and leak them. We'll clean them up for you. And so it's sort of this conflict. And it's like, I wish there was some sort of mode where it's like, oh, you put your machine in developer mode. I'm not going to clean them up for you. Like, this is a developer machine. You might even be testing your own thing. I'm going to like leave those things on there, make you suffer so you can fix your program. But actually, I think what we're doing is we're just cleaning them up now. We actually have a more lightweight way of checking whether or not the window behind it is gone, and that doesn't involve checking in with it every 10 seconds. And so coming soon, we'll start cleaning them up for you, which just tells me that what's going to happen is that after about a year, nobody is going to programmatically clean up their notification icons and rely on the system doing automatic cleanup. And so congratulations, we fixed a user interface annoyance and we made the ecosystem worse.
Interesting segue into making things more interesting. Control F4 in Outlook.
Okay.
I'm sorry, not Control F4, Control F. Sorry,
I knew he was going to ask this question, so I knew he asked it wrong. And I didn't know if I wanted to let everybody know that I knew he asked it wrong.
I did.
And so by talking about it, I'm basically selling him out. Control F in Outlook. So Control F in most programs means find. You Control F, and then you type some word to search. Except that in Outlook, Control F means forward. And the question is, why does Outlook use Control F for forward, when all programs that were written by sane people uses it for find? And the answer, the story I heard, is that when the original version of what became Outlook was written, they received a feature request / bug report. We really didn't distinguish between them, from one of the beta testers who said, I would really like Control F to be forward because that's what the hotkey was in the program that I used before. And we're like, okay, that's nice. The from line was Bill Gates. And so when you get a suggestion from the boss, it sort of carries a little more weight than a suggestion from your typical beta tester. I remember Steve Stanofsky, who told me when he was head of Windows, he was very careful whenever he submitted any feedback, any suggestions, because he knew the fact that his name was on it would cause it to carry undue weight. Like, he's like, I'm just this guy. Like, this is what I think. Please don't, it's just like me, Steve Stanofsky, end user, would like this thing. Not Steve Stanofsky, the guy who signed your paycheck, would like this thing. And so I don't know how he solved it. I want to say that he basically like found a buddy over in the dev team and said, hey, can you file this suggestion instead of me, because I don't want my name on it. That's what I would do. I sometimes I run into this problem where like I will update a wiki page, all of a sudden my name is on it, and then questions start coming in because they see my name on it. I'm like, I really need to create just some alias.
It's your tie.
It's my tie. It's my necktie. And it's like, oh, some guy called C. Kravitz updated this wiki, whatever. Well, he doesn't resolve in the address book. Okay, whatever. I'll go ask the team that owns the feature.
Create a security group.
Yeah. What?
Make the security group.
And the security group owns it. Then they'll mail the security group and they'll still come to me. So either way.
Gareth asks, what got you into blogging?
Oh, the story of how I got into blogging. It's actually a short story. We had,
So everyone be prepared for the next 20 minutes.
yeah, it's going to take a while, but it's a short story. There was some little group together. We got together, a group of us getting together, talking about, oh, blogging, that's really popular. Maybe we should start doing it. I don't know. And then Brad Abrams, who worked on the .NET framework at the time, and he had just started his own blog. And he just, and you know, it's like, Raymond, why don't you start a blog? I'm like, I don't know, because yeah, is there anything I have worth saying? And he said, just do it. I'm like, okay, if you tell me to do it, I guess I'll do it. So basically, I started a blog because Brad Abrams told me to start a blog. And as a result, I spent a total of maybe 15 to 20 seconds trying to think of a name. And the name, The Old New Thing, is me saying, well, everybody's all excited about whatever the hot new technology is. And I'm like, you know, old Win32 developer. Like even 20 years ago, I was old. So I'm old technology guy. I'm just going to write about older technologies. And so I'm the old new thing. I'm the thing that used to be the new thing. And so once I picked that name, it kind of stuck. I recycled it for my book. I recycled it for this talk. I recycle it for everything because it saves me the trouble of trying to come up with names for things. And yeah, it came out of about 15 to 20 seconds worth of thought. So I probably should have thought more about it, but it's too late now.
Okay.
I think we have a question in the room.
Can you please put it in the chat? Because otherwise, because then that's inclusive for the people that are virtual. I am actually going through the chat and actively asking. Raymond, can you talk about blowing off connectors in computers?
No, you don't blow them off. You blow into them. Blowing off means to ignore, to disregard.
I have shorthand. I apologize.
So this is a trick that one of my friends who worked in product support told me, is that when you suspect that something is not plugged in or is plugged in incorrectly, if you tell them, is it plugged in? They're going to say, well, of course it's plugged in. Like, how stupid do I look? I'm not going to call you if it's not plugged in. And they're not going to actually check if it's plugged in. Or they say, did you plug it into the correct port? And they're going to say, well, of course it's plugged into the correct port. Do I look like an idiot? But if you tell them, so sometimes those connectors get kind of dusty. And so what we found is sometimes what you need to do is you need to go in, unplug the cable, blow into the cable to get the dust out, blow into the connector to get the dust out, and then plug it back in. This is basically a Jedi mind trick because, number one, gets them to actually go under the desk and look at the computer. They'll unplug it. They blow into the connector. This has a side effect. They are no longer looking at the computer that it was plugged into. So the eye comes off of the connector. Then they go to plug it back in. They have to search from scratch for the correct port. They'll get the right port this time. Like they accidentally had the mouse plugged into the keyboard port. They do out, they blow into it. Now they lost, their eyes are no longer on the port that it came out of. Then they will go hunt and find the right port. So this is a trick that they learned. And the third great thing about this is a fantastic face-saving story, because sometimes they'll crawl down there and it wasn't plugged in, and they're just going to be like, and they'll just like, oh, okay, well, I'll do the blowing thing. I'll plug it in. I'll say, oh yeah, it works great now. And we don't have to say it wasn't plugged in. I give you a way to close the call and say, oh, I blew the dust out of the connector. Problem's fixed. You have a story you can tell your boss. Your boss won't, think less of you. It's like, oh, it's all great. So this is like, 3-step Jedi mind trick for getting people to double check that the cable is plugged into the correct port.
Can you tell us about Windows 98 Active Desktop and how TweakUI had an option to actually disable it?
Windows 98 Active Desktop. So here's a little secret. Inside the team, So you've all seen the active desktop crash screen. It's like, oh my goodness, your active desktop is here. Push this button to reset everything. So there were some of us who encountered this screen far too often. And so our nickname for the feature was Active Death Trap. The active desktop team was not a big fan of this nickname, but we used it anyway. So what was the question about active desktop? I just like to ramble.
Tell us how it came
about,
and then the irony of the tool you wrote had an option
turn it off.
To turn it off.
Well, the option I'll start from the end. The reason why there's an option to turn it off is because there was a policy to turn it off, because for a lot of more disruptive changes, there are group policies, so that way organizations, IT administrators can disable a bunch of new features because they don't want to try to retrain all of their employees on how to do this. Because it's like, oh my goodness, I got websites on my desktop, and then half the people just freak out. They call the support line. Their support line is totally swamped. And so they just deploy these policies. You know what? I just want this thing to work as much like the old system as possible. And so there is a group policy to say, don't do active desktop. And so Tweak UI, a lot of the things in Tweak UI was just providing a friendlier UI around existing settings. And so it just set the policy. If you check the box, it's like, yeah, I'll set the policy to disable active desktop, and there's no active desktop. So it's not like I hated active desktop, but it's just that there's a setting, and there was no easy way to get to the setting. So I give you an easier way to get to the setting. Why did we make active desktop? This is back in the days when everything wanted to be a web browser. I remember when the Internet Explorer team was being formed. One of the reasons why we created the Internet Explorer team to create a web browser was that at the time, every product team was writing a web browser. Like Excel, the Excel team, they're like, oh, this web thing is cool. We're going to put a web browser in Excel. And then, the PowerPoint team is like, web stuff is cool. We're going to put a web browser. And everybody would be writing their own web browser. Notepad is like, what would make Notepad great if we had a web browser in there too. Okay, maybe not Notepad.
Terminal.
Huh?
Never mind.
Yeah. Encarta is like, oh, want to make Encarta great? We'll put a web browser in it. So everybody was writing a web browser. There were like 12 web browser projects, all springing up all over the company. And this was like, okay, this is ridiculous. We do not need 12 web browsers. And so it's like, okay, we'll just have one team to make a web browser, and then you can all use it. How's that sound? And the other teams were like, okay, I guess. And so that was the world that we lived in, where everybody thought the web browser was going to take over the world. Spoiler alert, the web browser took over the world. And so everyone was trying to find a way to incorporate it into their product. And so the Shell team was like, it would be really cool if your desktop was a web browser. Because it's like, yeah, it's like, there you go, right? Drop the mic. It's like, we win. Your web browser, your desktop is a web browser. You don't even have to open anything. It's already there. We can put web pages directly on your desktop. We have channels. We have, I don't know, everybody. This was also when Pointcast, I don't know if you remember Pointcast. They were one of the early companies to do pushing content to your desktop. So you had the Pointcast screensaver, which was just a screensaver that just sucked data from whatever backend server they had and put it up on your screen. And so everybody was really excited because it's like, oh my goodness, we can have server-driven content delivered straight to your desktop. So everybody wanted a piece of that. And so everybody was trying to think of ways we could have server content being pushed to users' desktops. And so Active Desktop was one of the ways is like, yeah, users can just pin their favorite website to their desktop. And so also all the internal mockups, whenever there's an internal mockup of hey, users can pin content, the content is always the weather. If you take a look at pictures, all the screenshots of things you can do with Windows, there's 5 copies of the weather widget all over the screen. It's it's on your start menu, it's on your taskbar, you open Notepad, and by the way, here's the current weather. It's I don't know what's going on. People think that people like to check the weather every 30 seconds. But so in these mockups, you always saw the weather, you saw traffic, and you saw today's Dilbert. Like those, like if you wanted to do a satirical mock-up of what every product looked like, you just put up a thing, put the weather, put traffic, and put Dilbert in it, and said that's our product, and everybody's going to be like, yep, I know what that product is. I don't know if that's still true. It's probably not Dilbert anymore. It's something else. But weather and traffic are probably still there. Yes. Yeah. So the remark in the room is that basically AI today is where web browsers were in 1995, which is everybody's looking for a way to make their product an AI product now, because that's the cool thing. And probably 3 years ago it was crypto. It's like, if I can make my product a crypto product, then I'm gonna make billions. And so, you know, like, will it be crypto? Will AI end up like crypto? Will AI end up like the web browser? Who knows?
Okay, so
option at PowerToys to disable Windows compiler.
So what I believe it is GPO, group policy. All things have to typically be turned off, and Raymond just exposed it, was the big one.
Yeah, so the remark in the room is like, hey, if you're going to let us turn off active desktop, you should let us turn off a whole bunch of other stuff. And the answer is Tweak UI, all he really did was provide a nicer checkbox UI over the group policy editor. And so it's not, he didn't invent, Tweak UI did not invent any new features. It merely exposed existing ones that were harder to find. And so often, like when people would send in requests for new Tweak UI features, it'd be like, yeah, could Tweak UI do this thing? I'm like, dude, like that's not a thing. It's not like a thing that I can just enable. Like I'd have to write code, and I don't want to write code. Like I want to, like, you know, set registries and send messages and stuff. Like I don't want to actually write code, because then I'd have to maintain it.
Speaking of code, I apologize if I'm mispronouncing your name. Hugh asks, hi Raymond, can you give me some advice on learning Windows and programming from a junior high school student?
Ooh.
So I can tell you what I said.
It's been a long time since I was in junior high school.
But you've dealt with interns and a bunch of other people. So my opinion here is try everything. If you can get your access to it, your computer can run it, try it. Frameworks, languages, build a project, do something you love. That's kind of like my opinion. Because you get your hands dirty, you hit some random bug, you're like, how do I solve this? And then you go and work and progressively solve it. And that's what everyone in this room and online have done. And that's why we're able to now predict issues, is because we've suffered through those embarrassing things like a semicolon missing. And you're on stage and you're like, oh no, oh no. And then Ginny, who's in the audience, is like, line 43, semicolon. True story.
Okay, my take, I like Clint's answer. My answer is like, we didn't know what the question was going to be. My take on it is to like find something that you're interested in, and just like go deep, understand how this thing works. And you know, don't worry too much that you picked the wrong thing, because just the fact that you understand very well how something works, it means you get to see the decisions that went into making something, which is something you can carry forward when designing your own software. That even if you end up working on something else, like for example, UI frameworks. There are so many UI frameworks out there. Just pick one and get really good at it. Even if it's not the UI framework you end up working with for real, a lot of the concepts will transfer, right? It's like, you know, the concept of dispatching work to threads and coalescing work and all that stuff. Even if you're not using the same UI framework, the concepts are still there. The idea of, you know, message flow, all those things. And so that's my suggestion, is to like pick a thing and try to understand it like really deeply. And then even if that specific thing that you understand deeply isn't useful, the knowledge that you learn from that understanding can be transferred to other things.
Great. Okay, I'm going to ask a prepared question right now. Can you tell me about why there are reserved file names?
Yes, the reserved file names like con and null. So this goes back to CPM, but let me rewind. Not quite rewind so much. Actually, I'm going to start all the way at CPM. So CPM, wonderful, cute little operating system, runs on what 8080 processors. It had a couple of special devices, TTY, con, LPT, that referred to the screen, your printer, your card punch, your card reader, all those essential peripherals that every computer even today still carries around. And so MS-DOS 1.0 came out. MS-DOS was very strongly influenced by CPM. The system call codes, if you look up in the book, the system call codes actually align, most of the early ones align with the CPM system call codes. When Intel made the 8086 processor, the registers were set up and the instruction set architecture was set up so that way you could actually do a mechanical translation for the most part of 8080 code into 8086. Like there were natural correspondences between the old registers and the new ones. And so MS-DOS 1.0, one of its goals was to simplify the porting path from CPM to MS-DOS. And so one of the things that I carried over was these special file names like TTY and so on. And so if you open a file called con, it opened the console. And so that's great. Now, next comes, oh, and then the other thing was that, okay, so suppose you're running the assembler, because compilers can't run a compiler, too big. You can run an assembler. You run the assembler and it asks you for the name of the input file, and you type in like Fred. And so it says, okay, well, I can add .asm to that because fred.asm, that's the source file. What would you like your object file to be? And you can just say, oh, Fred. I was like, yeah, it's great. Fred.obj. I'll add .obj for you. No problem. Save you some typing. Where would you like the program listing to go? And you're like, I don't want a program listing. Like that thing's going to be like 500 pages. I don't have that much paper. So you can type null, NUL. And then the assembler will say, oh, yeah, that's null.lst because I'm going to append suffix file name extension to it. And it would dutifully spew an entire program listing out to the file null.lst. And so MS-DOS said, you know what? If I see a file whose name is null.anything, I'm just going to treat it as the null device. And that lets you throw away your assembly output, your assembly listing output, instead of filling a file or actually sending it to the real printer. Like if you wanted to go directly to the printer, you could just say LPT1 and it would open it to LPT1.lst. And the .lst was ignored because we saw LPT1, magic name, out it goes directly to the printer, didn't consume any disk space, which is great because your floppy disks only had 160K. So this is how you can actually get your output without running out of disk space. So that was why the magic file names are recognized even when there's an extension added, is so that way these programs like the assembler who didn't know that there were these magic file names you could still trick them into using the magic files. Then with MS-DOS 2.0, we added these things called directories, which are like really cool. So now you could change to a directory, run the assembler, but these old assemblers, they were written for MS-DOS 1.0. They don't know anything about subdirectories. So when they ask for a file, they just open the file name. So if they open null.lst, and that would therefore open it in the current directory. And so now it means that if we want this null.lst trick to work, then the null file has to exist in every directory because these old 1.0 programs that don't know about subdirectories are just going to open it in whatever directory they're in. And so as a result of these decisions from CPM, like it's carried forward. And so we still have in every directory, there's still a pretend file called null with any extension that acts as the null device. And like we can't take it away now. Like if you take a look at batch files, you look at the batch files that you've written. First of all, I'm sorry you had to write a batch file. if you take a look at the batch files that you've written, you'll probably see something like copy con, or at least in like instructions on how to like, oh, create a file, copy con foo.txt, or dir greater than null. And so all of those, like, even today, people are still relying on the fact that these magic devices, con, null, exist in every directory. And so if we turn them off, then like people would start getting file not found on copy con and have little files called null all over their machine. So it's like a decision made,
50 years ago,
30, 40 years ago is still haunting us. It's like that legend of why railroad tracks are specific distance apart. And there's this, according to the story, it all dates back to like the axle length of chariots in Roman times. I don't know if it's true, but that's the story. It's a similar type of thing where there's this chain of compatibility going all the way back to CPM.
Okay. Let's talk about some crazy bugs. What's your favorite crazy bug? And there's another story I want you to tell.
Well, I'm gonna tell a story about the crazy bug that drove me crazy. Like I said, in the Windows 95 project, among other things, one of my main responsibilities was MS-DOS game compatibility. And there was one game, Speed Racer, and the Mystery of Racer X. There was a bug filed against this game that said, when you start the game, after it plays the intro music, it crashes. So I'm like, okay, here we go. Run the program. Yep, there it is. Crashes right after the theme music. So I'm sitting in there. It took me probably a week to debug this thing, running it over and over again, trying to figure out why it's crashing right after the theme music plays. And eventually it turns out that, it's an undocumented feature of the x80 of the 8386 chip, where if you did a ring transition return into a 32-bit app that was running on a 16-bit stack, the high bits of the ESP register were not zeroed out. So it's a thing. I claim it's insufficiently documented Intel documentation. I don't know if it's true, but that's my story. I'm sticking with it. But I had to listen to that theme music for a week. Like I just went, I cannot watch any Speed Racer things. If there's any Speed Racer anywhere ever, I just like, no, turn that thing off. You cannot, like, if you want to terrorize me, just like start humming the Speed Racer theme song and I will just like run away screaming. So
if you do the math, that's 30 years later. This is how much you hate Speed Racer.
I do
remember
not,
how
I have to make it clear. I do not actually hate Speed Racer. I'm sure he's a perfectly wonderful person. But his music, he needs to get new music.
Pivoting into other very interesting bugs, can you talk about a certain CD and celebrity singing a song?
Yes. So this is a story I told I think earlier this year, and somehow like got picked up everywhere. So there was an OEM that was doing some testing. This was back in the Windows XP days, and they filed a bug that said whenever we play Janet Jackson's Rhythm Nation, the computer crashes. That song, just that song, no other song. And it's like, come on, you got to be kidding me, right? And so it's like, well, doesn't repro on our machine. Like we can play Janet Jackson all we want. Now, mind you, I don't know how much we want, but we can play a lot of Janet Jackson and it doesn't crash. And they're like, no, trust me. Come to our lab, watch it crash. Play Janet Jackson crashes. But then in their further investigation, they found that not only does playing Janet Jackson crash their laptop, playing Janet Jackson crashes their competitor's laptop. Some models. Furthermore, they found that playing Janet Jackson crashes not only the laptop that's playing Janet Jackson, but a laptop next to it that happens to be sitting on the same table. That wasn't playing Janet Jackson at all. All right, so now it's like, okay, what kind of wacky voodoo is Janet Jackson up to? The investigation identified this source is that the Janet Jackson song contained a repeated note that hit the natural resonant frequency of the specific model of hard drive that this laptop used. And so when it hits that frequency, the hard drive vibrates, hits a disk I/O error, and depending on whose I/O failed, if it was a kernel I/O that failed, kernel's like, dude, I don't know what to do when an I/O fails. I'm crashing, and you blue screen. And that explains why it crashes nearby laptops, because it's propagating through sound. It's why it crashes some laptops made by the competitors, because they source their hard drives from the same manufacturer. And the OEM finally fixed the problem by adding a software filter to the playback pipeline that detects this one frequency and filters it out. So that way it doesn't trigger the natural resonant frequency of that particular model of hard drive. Now, the thing that worries me is that there's a audio pipeline filter somewhere in this OEM's like standard driver pack with a sticker that says "Do not remove," and they didn't write down why. They didn't say it's because of this particular brand of laptop. All that it says is "Do not remove," and so my worry is that that filter is like still there on all of their laptops, even though they have moved beyond. They've stopped using 5,400 RPM hard drives from that particular manufacturer anymore. But hopefully they figured it out, that whoever put the "Do not remove" sticker actually wrote "Do not remove until we stop using this brand of hard drive." So that's the story of Janet Jackson crashing hard drives. For some reason, this story really tickled everybody's fancy. People did all sorts of investigations to find the specific frequency. Why Janet Jackson? So the reason why it was Janet Jackson, somebody figured out, is that the song Rhythm Nation by Janet Jackson is recorded at a non-standard tuning. Is not recorded at the standard tuning of A440. It's pitched up a little bit, which is why its notes don't hit the same frequencies as the notes that most other songs use. So that's the special thing about why it specifically took Janet Jackson's Rhythm Nation to crash these hard drives.
Okay, well, we are at time. So I want to thank everyone. Thank you, everyone that asked the question. We appreciate your feedback at aka.ms/Microsoft Build Evals. If you have any other questions for Raymond, his tie is on Twitter, and he has some fantastic blogs as well. Thank you, everybody.